Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, Equity and Justice Concerns of Carbon Forestry, Lessons from Field Studies, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Emily Gasparini, and I am a program associate with the Forest and Climate team. And our presenters today are Stephanie Palladino, Shirley Fisk, and Pamela McElwee. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're also always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat area and I'll try to get you sorted out as quickly as possible. And questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen. We'll follow as many as possible, we'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional resources, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session once it goes live. And I usually try and post that that same afternoon or the next morning. So thank you all again for joining us. And with that, we'll get started. Next slide, please. So Shirley, I believe you are our first presenter. Please take us away. Oh, Shirley, I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to Emily and to WWF for setting up this platform for discussion. We're going to start. What we're going to cover today is I'm going to do the introduction, then we're going to do a deep dive into a case study in Vietnam. We'll come back to lessons from the book and then talk about bringing ideas forward and have Q&A. And as Emily said, my name's Shirley Fisk. I'm a cultural anthropologist at University of Maryland. I'm an environmental and policy anthropologist. And for the last 30 years, I've had a career in the U.S. federal government at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and in the legislature. I worked for the U.S. Senate and on climate change legislation and policy. So let's get right in. Next slide, please. Want to take a close look at the cover because it sets up the dynamic for the entire book. This is symbolic of what is the problem. The problem is too many carbon emissions. This happens to be Tokyo at night, but it's typical of any major metropolitan area across the globe. And our carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation are the problem. Next slide, please. So the next slide is a close-up of, it's the top panel on our book cover, solution. The solution is seen in carbon governance as people who are doing reforestation, better forest stewardship, less forest degradation, less deforestation, and so on. Next slide, please. Well, let's stick with this one. Sorry, can we go back? So the book really is about carbon governance, social equity, and forest carbon, but the focus is on social equity. Essentially, who benefits from individual carbon projects introduced in Uganda or Amazonia? What's in it for the participants? How does it affect their families and livelihoods? And these Ugandan men have actually formed a landowners alliance to resist the expansion of the national park in the background and an associated carbon offset project. So their traditional lands are being contested as a result of what we're calling carbon governance, the carbon fix. So there are a number of critical concerns like this, who benefits, in the book that explores through 19 chapters and case studies. These examples. Next slide, please. For us, why did we do this book anyway? What was the need? The most critical reason for the book was that there was a dearth of studies and evaluations about how projects are actually playing out on the ground with respect to rural and forest-dependent peoples, their rights, and participation in welfare. And we began the book in 2009. 2010, believe it or not. And as WWF says about UNRED in the write-up of this webinar, REDD was seen as a win-win situation where big wins could be made in reducing carbon globally, and at the same time, wins could be made by distributing the benefits of carbon markets to people who live in forest environments in developing nations. At the time that we started the book, Stephanie was working in southern Mexico, where she'd been hired as a local research institute, by a local research institution to help assess the social impacts of a long-running voluntary market carbon offset project based on agroforestry. And I was working in the US Senate on climate change legislation, and the question was whether or not we should have carbon offsets in the bill as a way to get corporations and utilities to buy into the the cap and trade bill. So although Stephanie and I came from very different vantage points as anthropologists in our respective field sites, we came to the same realization that a carbon mitigation mandate was changing the worlds of forest dwellers, whether it's tribal groups on reserves in South America, agroforestry communities, or rural communities across the globe. And there was basically, the bottom line is there was a lack of nuanced understanding about land use-based carbon mitigation. How is it happening, where, what it means for livelihoods. Next slide, please. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I did want to give you a teaser about what the book covers. You can see each of the sections, which are largely wonderful case studies, all in different contexts that involve REDD, in most cases, rights and equity. I will say one thing about the first section, and that is that first section really puts the development of the carbon regime in the context of global trends, both philosophically, theoretically, and conceptually, and traces its development. So that's a good overview section. The rest of them are case studies. Next slide, please. These are examples of types of social justice concerns that arise in each of the chapters again and again. I won't go through them all, but I wanted you to see the breadth. Of course, they're the three pillars of distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition. And I'll only say something about one of the ones towards the bottom, traditional and customary property rights, because this is critical. Where they exist, and some nations recognize customary property rights, how are they being supplemented or interpreted? And what are the interests of the state? And do they conflict with local understandings? How are sacred lands and landscapes being handled? And it's not only land tenure, but some nations are separating out the actual trees themselves as property, and not only that, but carbon. Who owns the carbon that's sequestered in trees and vegetation? On top of that, there's different colonial histories for different nations, of course, different political regimes that have left their mark and left their legacy. So all of this goes to the complexity of what we thought was going to be simple if land tenure was just resolved ahead of time. And lastly, benefits, of course. What constitutes the benefits? So the last slide, please. So why is this still relevant today? Why is all this discussion still relevant today? So as you probably know, REDD Plus has very general guidelines, mostly derived from COP16 at Cancun, and namely the 7 safeguards, which are, like I said, very general, and they technically remain suggestions. They're shoulds, quote unquote, and they're not mandates, a must or a will in the language. And we know that the Paris Agreement urges nations to develop monitoring and reporting systems for how they're doing these things, but the guidelines about social safeguards themselves have not gotten more specific or detailed, and they remain unspecified. For example, what constitutes, quote unquote, participation? How much? How little? What is it? So in the end, it appears to me anyways, having come back from Bonn and the climate change talks there, that the direction that we're going in globally is to codify the status quo, current principles from Cancun, agreeing on the need for transparency and monitoring systems, but leaving the guidelines up to each nation to quote, promote, and support. Very weak language gives a lot of flexibility to nations. And this is why it is so important to review what's happening on the ground and continue to promote discussion about nuances, outcomes, and requirements for social justice in REDD type projects and unread policies. So that's it as an introduction to the book and the setup for the relevancy of this. And we're going to turn next to Dr. Pamela McElwee at Rutgers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shirley. Yeah, so next slide, please. So I'm Pam McElwee. I'm an associate professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Human Ecology. I'm trained as both a forester and an anthropologist. I have a PhD in both. And I've been working in Vietnam on forest policy for more than 20 years now. I've been specifically working on some REDD research projects that I'm going to be talking about for the next 10 minutes or so since 2011. And a lot of these research projects that I've been engaged in have involved collaborators in Vietnam who've been working with me very carefully to try to understand the rollout of REDD policy at the national level, as well as provincial and local levels. We've done a number of interviews with policymakers and stakeholders at these different levels as part of our research project over the last, I guess, 6 or 7 years now. So we've interviewed about 50 policymakers and stakeholders. We've also been doing household surveys on the livelihoods impacts of different forest policies, including reforestation policies, payment for environmental service policies, and the rollout of REDD. REDD hasn't actually paid anyone in most of the places that we've been researching, so we've really been looking at the rollout of policies as opposed to the impacts of benefits so far. We've done these household surveys in 7 provinces to try to capture different forest types, land tenure situations, different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, and so forth. So next slide, please. We've been essentially trying to ask questions about how both national level policy making and then some specific local REDD projects are dealing with what we see as really key issues: participation and livelihoods, chief among them, and then how can safeguards be used potentially to enforce or support participation and livelihoods. So one key challenge, as Shirley noted, is that we know that REDD in most places is going to be a nested model. There's going to be some sort of national framework that reports up to the UN FPIC, but then there's going to be various projects at subnational levels as well. And so we need to balance both national and local, as well as specific projects and national policies of varying types. And that balance also has to include international expectations that have been coming out of the COP meetings, particularly the Cancun COP in 2010 and then the Warsaw one in 2013, that provided this framework of guidance, particularly on safeguards. So this balance also has to include the need to take into account local circumstances to allow for flexibility in this nested implementation. So all of this together presents a number of challenges. As one local official said to me, getting involved in REDD is like, quote, grabbing for the sky, unquote, and that it seems like a really far off and impossible task to meet both the international obligations, but also local expectations. So those are the sorts of things that we've been looking at in our research project in particular. How have these participatory mechanisms, if they exist, been included in REDD priorities at these nested levels? How have these different levels dealt with questions of livelihoods, both at the project level, but also in the implementation of policies at the national level? And we're particularly interested if the poorest households are going to be able to benefit from REDD. And then finally, we're following how safeguards are being developed, both again at the national level through a safeguards roadmap for the whole country of Vietnam, but also how specific project level REDD projects are dealing with safeguards. So next slide, please. So as Shirley mentioned, the UN FPIC guidance on local participation is not very clear. It's sort of folded into safeguards, but it really leaves up to countries themselves to decide how they want to tackle participation. So a lot of donors, such as the UN REDD project, have called for clear systems of information access and local participation. But what we're seeing on the ground in Vietnam is that these have generally been weak in pilot activities. They've been weak at the national level in the rollout of REDD policies, and they've been weak in specific projects. So one of the problems we've been looking at is that there's really very little evidence of procedural equity. That is, communities have really only been consulted after the fact. So after a REDD project has come in, the decision has already been made by local officials to participate in REDD, then local communities are sometimes called in for a 1 or 2 hour session of FPIC. But at that point, the project has already been cleared. It's already too late in the process to really consider this to be procedural equity. We've also documented a few cases in Vietnam where some communities have gone through FPIC and they were only presented with the benefits of REDD projects and not the risks. So this raises questions if that FPIC was really truly informed consent. We've also documented some cases where FPIC was used with communities that don't actually have secure land tenure rights. So they were being asked to give consent to activities that had some unclear legality. So that's a problem as well. Next slide, please. So we've also been looking at what the potential for livelihoods challenges are. So because there haven't been REDD payments, there's been no results-based payments either at the national level or anything in terms of most projects at the local level. And those projects are mostly on the voluntary carbon market, and they just haven't been very successful in selling carbon credits. So that means money has not really been transferred to communities in most cases yet. And it's been a real problem to prioritize livelihood benefits through the mechanism that's being used for rolling out REDD. And that mechanism in Vietnam has been primarily provincial forest departments, so the subnational level. And these departments are asked to essentially participate in discussions of safeguards, discussions of carbon monitoring, and so forth. But these departments are really dominated by professional foresters, and they have very little training in socioeconomics and very little interest in local livelihoods. They're mainly people who have done forest inventories all their lives. So asking them to take on livelihood aspects of REDD has been very challenging, to say the least. Another major problem for livelihoods is that REDD activities on the ground in many provinces, at least the ones that we've documented, are primarily targeting ethnic minority households because they're presumed to practice shifting or swidden cultivation and to be agents of deforestation. But this has meant that there's been an exclusion of attention to other drivers of deforestation, particularly state-led logging, so state-owned logging companies, and state-driven coffee and rubber expansion. So foresters tell us in interviews that they feel very weak about taking on those agribusinesses or those other bureaucracies in the government, but they feel much more stronger in telling local farmers what to do. So that's a potential problem, that we're maybe looking at the wrong drivers and not getting a full picture of forest change. Finally, there's very few REDD pilots or projects that we've been looking at in Vietnam that are using REDD as a tool to encourage land tenure reform. So land tenure reform remains highly uneven in Vietnam. There's a lot of poor quality forest lands that are managed officially by the state, but de facto they're in local use. So land tenure reform and decentralization, giving land tenure rights that are secure to these local communities, has been pointed to as one of the biggest barriers to better forest management in Vietnam. But our concern is that REDD may not be the best vehicle to instill that change. It really becomes a chicken and egg problem. You need secure land tenure for successful REDD, but then you need to take money and enthusiasm for REDD to spur land tenure reform. And right now we're not really getting either. So even in a few cases where we've documented specific projects that have tackled land tenure reform by trying to issue community land tenure certificates, there have still been negative livelihood impacts because farmers have been asked to abstain from doing swidden agriculture, but yet there's no money coming in because carbon credits haven't been sold yet. So that's a potential problem. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we ask is, can the development of safeguards tackle these problems of participation and livelihoods? So at the national level, there's a draft roadmap for safeguards, but it's really been focusing on a very legalistic approach. It's basically taking what the Cancun guidance has provided and not really amplifying that or making it more locally appropriate to Vietnam. It's very rote. It's very formalistic. There's not anything that's innovative to improve participation, nothing very systematic about livelihood development either. So the NGOs that we've worked with in Vietnam and interviewed are really concerned that safeguards reporting, that's going to be one of the requirements for results-based payment, is also going to be very formulaic, and it's not really going to have an appropriate country context. It's not going to include serious consideration of how to protect vulnerable peoples from abuse or how to promote more equitable livelihoods. So the safeguards roadmap right now talks about access to information, but this is very weak in a country like Vietnam because people don't have widespread internet access in rural areas. They may not know how to make use of public information. So NGOs, for example, have suggested maybe appointing public advocates at local areas, well-respected local people that could help guide communities through public information systems. These NGOs have also suggested that the safeguards roadmap needs to potentially have grievance mechanisms. So if you're harmed, if you've had a livelihood impact, there's a clear route to complain and to move your complaint upwards and have it be acknowledged. Next slide, please. So what are the lessons learned from the Vietnam case study? I think there's a couple of things that we can point to. The first one is that we know that REDD is unlikely to be quick. So REDD has been talked about for nearly 10 years in Vietnam, but yet we haven't seen any results-based payments. And so for some Vietnamese communities, they've actually made a little joke of the acronym of REDD, and they've called it in the phrase in Vietnamese, "Rồi em đi về đến," which means "here you come and go again." You just keep coming and telling us about REDD, and nothing ever happens in terms of benefits. So we know that the development of these safeguards policies, which is not complete in Vietnam, it's been going on for a long time, really hasn't led to an adequate way to address land tenure or gender relations or participation. So it's been a very slow process. We also know it's unlikely to be cheap. Just rolling out REDD readiness in Vietnam has exceeded $15 million US, and it's not done yet. So this needs to be built in. It's not enough to talk about opportunity costs of REDD. We need to talk about how expensive the administration of a truly participatory, livelihood secure REDD system is going to be. And finally, we know it's not going to be easy. One of the things we've noticed in our project, because we've looked at or our research project, we've looked at specific REDD projects across the country, is that even in a small country like Vietnam, there's a huge disparity between forest types, communities, policy systems, and expectations. Land tenure in particular is very uneven across the country. And so having a one-size-fits-all approach, trying to have a national framework for REDD, is very difficult to balance all of these competing interests. So this idea that REDD is going to be a quick and easy fix, at least for our case study in Vietnam, we know that's simply not going to be the case. So there's a number of other lessons from the rest of the book, and so I will turn it over to Stephanie Palladino to present some of the remaining case studies of the book.
Great, thank you, Pam. So this is Stephanie Palladino. I'm also an environmental anthropologist with some training in natural resources management and even a sometime farmer. And I've been working with issues of environmental governance and how they relate to things like social equity and sustainability for a long time, both as researcher but also as practitioner on the ground working with local organizations in the US and outside the US on those issues. So what I'm going to do then is build on Pam's excellent presentation that really shows so many different intersecting equity issues that we want to learn more about and improve in relation to REDD Plus and forest carbon projects, and try to draw out some of the lessons that come from the multiple studies in the book. Next slide, please, actually. What I want to say as a preface to that is that even though Vietnam presents a very distinct national context, as Pam has discussed, we find that many of the issues that she's identified are actually echoed in various ways and to various degrees in many of the other country settings that are represented in the book, even though they may not always play out in the same ways or even sometimes play out in very unexpected ways. Next slide, please. So this slide gives an indication on the left side of the slide of the geographic spread of the cases that are included in the book. These on the left side, these are the regions where we have cases, where we have chapters talking about both REDD plus and the occasional payment for environmental services case, with in some instances multiple projects for a given country being considered. And I want to mention that, as Shirley mentioned, the book actually approaches equity questions in relation to REDD plus at many other levels, including in a general sense as a form of environmental governance. But what we're focusing on here in this presentation is just the aspects that have to do with rural and indigenous peoples' participation in forest carbon. Next slide, please. So in relation to that focus of the book, I want to mention some fundamental underlying questions that we're interested in. And one of those is has to do with how the ways in which REDD, in its very many forms, is being constructed and implemented on the ground, and how those ways affect the relative distribution of rural and indigenous people's rights, roles, risks, and benefits in relation to carbon-targeted lands. So this question is about, acknowledging that few people argue the merits of preserving forests for a variety of purposes, but is this the best way to go about it, or are there other ways to do so with maybe better or different implications for the local folks involved? A second important question is just quite straightforwardly, can policies and practices such as social safeguards and free, prior, and informed consent, something that I find hard to say quickly, can they actually be effective in protecting the rights and interests of local rural stakeholders? A third question underlying the book kind of shifts the focus a little bit, and it's asking about whether forest-dependent people can actually make forest carbon trading and related financial incentives work for their own objectives and on their own terms. So this is kind of asking whether the relationship of rural forest stakeholders to carbon forestry in its various forms, not just REDD, activities, whether they can go beyond being the objects of benefits, impacts, and risks to actually fashioning forest carbon into an instrument for their own aims. Next slide, please. So frankly, the studies in this book really suggest a very mixed record in relation to these questions, and as I mentioned before, sometimes in unexpected ways. And so I'm going to try to pull out some of the interesting themes. There's really quite a lot of rich data that we can't even get to in this framework. And as mentioned before, there's a set of very fundamental issues and concerns that fall to nations participating in the UN framework for REDD plus to address. And this list should be familiar to most of our listeners, and I'll just go through them quickly to speak them out loud. These are things that have been recognized as very important to being allowed to enable REDD plus activities to function on the ground. And they include things like very fundamentally looking at the security of land tenure and resource rights, developing country-specific policies and practices for social safeguards and informed consent, for defining who will have rights to carbon and by extension carbon payments. It also falls on nations to develop their carbon accounting systems, which is my shorthand for how REDD credits will ultimately be tracked and counted against national carbon reduction goals. And it also falls on them to look at some kind of review internal national policies around land use and forest use and try to harmonize them, if you will, or help them move towards supporting avoided deforestation. So these are obviously really formidable and challenging and frankly politically sensitive tasks that are not going to be accomplished overnight, and indeed mirroring what Pam describes for Vietnam, in few of the cases described in our book have the national REDD policies and programs advanced very much on these items. Actually, glacial progress is how one author characterized it in their particular setting. But the case studies do show how all of these pieces, and especially this lack of advancement or slow advancement on national policies for them, can have really substantial equity consequences around REDD activities. And this is true for both projects that are specifically undertaken as pilots within the UN global framework, as well as those that are developing independently and having their sights set on interacting more with voluntary markets in their own ways. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about each of these in relation to the lessons coming out of, or the experiences documented in the book. Security of rights to land and resources is, fundamentally recognized as an important equity, as affecting equity outcomes for local people, both in potentially allowing forest dwellers and keepers to benefit from carbon revenues, but also as potentially putting them at risk for displacement or losses from carbon activities. And on this point, the case studies document very interesting and different kinds of outcomes. So sadly, we do have studies in the book that report actual or threatened displacements of land, forest, and other resource rights, as well as of potential carbon rights. And in these cases, this is largely in settings where customary land rights are contested, weakened, or overridden by the claims of the state to the majority of forest land. These are often settings where forest reserves and other forest lands are concessioned by the state to maybe afforestation and reforestation projects, or, as Pam mentioned, to commercial logging and other extractive activities. So these are settings where the interests in improving the security of land and resource rights for rural stakeholders appear to be in conflict with other state interests. And so these are pretty formidable concerns and unlikely to be easily changed. On the other hand, even in countries that have been out in front in the areas of payment for environmental services and REDD, and where, more importantly, customary and collective forms of land tenure are legally recognized by the state, we see other kinds of equity problems arising. So for instance, in Brazil, we have a case, a study that talks about the first indigenous forest carbon project in the world to be certified, and then to be lucky enough to find voluntary market buyer, and how it ended up being blocked by going forward by ambiguities in national laws, which were compounded by a lack of clear national REDD policies at that moment, that made it unclear whether indigenous peoples actually have the rights to develop carbon projects, sell carbon, or receive carbon revenues directly. Kind of a shocking or unexpected outcome in a setting like Brazil. In another case study, talks about Papua New Guinea, again, a country that's been out in front of the REDD issues, and also a country where customary land tenure is legally recognized and actually the predominant mode. And there, the case talks about how national policies for REDD and carbon revenues were in an undefined and sort of constant state of flux for a period, and how that opened the way to very spurious sort of cowboy carbon deals with landowners, and how it then led to further developments in locally managed carbon projects being stymied. So here, ironically, because rights to carbon in these settings were not clearly defined at the national levels, even though rural and indigenous peoples were legally recognized as owners and managers of forests, it didn't automatically translate into them having legal rights to either run carbon projects or receive carbon revenues. Next slide, please. Similarly, on the element of informed consent and social safeguards, the case studies have mixed results. So going back to Brazil again, not to pick on Brazil, but just to pick out an example from there. One of our cases describes how a particularly vulnerable indigenous group effectively signed away carbon rights to 100% of their territory to a private waste management company, again under sort of dubious conditions of informed consent. And in the absence of clear, specific national REDD safeguards, it was only because FUNAI, the national agency charged with indigenous affairs, stepped in and called the project on its ethics and illegality, that the deal was impeded from going through. Other cases show how these national voids in relation to social safeguards end up being filled by the social policies of donor agencies, NGOs, and certifying agencies. But they also raise questions about, questions of consistency among these different policies and practices, and whether there is much in place that to be able to evaluate and hold them accountable for how effective they are. And yet, on a third hand, if we have a third hand, we have the case of the Kazi Hills community-based REDD project in India, described in our book, which apparently finds that the lack of national safeguard policies has actually allowed the project to develop its own social monitoring and evaluation criteria, rather than having to respond to criteria applied from the outside. Next slide, please. Finally, several of the study authors point to the same kind of imbalances that Pamela mentioned in relation to national land use and forest use policies, where, in a sense, where REDD and other forest carbon projects end up being targeted towards the rural poor, often imposing or promoting changes in their livelihoods or in other practices, while at the same time there are policies that are actively allowing other kinds of forest conversions to go on. So I think Pam did a good job of talking about that, but we see that reflected in other situations. Next slide, please. So to this point, I've been talking a lot about an array of largely structural and sort of contextual factors which under the UN framework for REDD+, fall to nations to address. But the studies also show the importance of what could be called the particularities of local contexts in influencing equity outcomes around REDD+ projects. And so the studies highlight how power dynamics and contestations over legitimacy and voice also happen at regional and local levels, and ways that different kinds of leadership and social groups and social experiences come together at particular moments and create particular outcomes. They also point to the fact that local level interactions often mean that the social and ecological consequences of forest carbon projects are not limited just to the forest areas themselves, but often track far out beyond their limits, and that's important to pay attention to. This collection as a whole is very good at showing how these different local contexts interact with wider structural factors, and really suggest a variety of things to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So let's shift gears for a moment from talking about the experiences of specific cases in the book to what these experiences suggest for how equity outcomes of REDD+ activities might actually be strengthened. And these are things that we think have implications for other kinds of land use-based mitigation projects that may also impact rural and indigenous populations. Next slide, please. So a lot of the research in the book and also outside of the book point to the fact that while there's been a massive investment, financial, political, and administrative, in developing the more technocratic policies and procedures and practices related to REDD+ on a global level, there's been relatively little invested in comparable social processes and policies. And some of the things that are pointed out, as areas that really are crying out for this kind of investment, I'll mention briefly. And there are many more than this, of course. So we're all familiar with concepts of, carbon baselines, but what about the idea of social baselines? So if we want to know how or whether REDD+ projects are contributing to livelihoods and participation and those kinds of things, maybe we need to have something that resembles social baselines. And at the same time, we also need to be investing in tracking how these social processes unfold as time goes on. We not only need to invest in these safeguard measures and procedures for informed consent, but we also need to look at very specifically what are appropriate ones for particular these very particular local contexts. Any of us that work in FPIC kinds of things know how important that is. There's also a crying need for building capacity for local groups to design, manage, and take over more of the technical and bureaucratic aspects of REDD+ projects. Next slide, please. And that's something that we've been seeing some progress on, but there just needs to be all the case studies point to how important that is in improving equity outcomes. We also see that things like building in networks of partners for rural stakeholders really helps increase the skill sets and knowledge base and resources available to them. And questions are raised about whether maybe we need to invest in broader civil society processes for developing social safeguards and informed consent. So all of these things, of course, require investment of many kinds, as I mentioned, whether it's political or administrative, but they also require financing. And a common observation across cases is that carbon prices, carbon revenues alone are not sufficient sources to finance that. Next slide, please. So for my last couple slides, I just want to mention that, kind of come up a level and think about ways in which maybe we also need to reframe REDD as a social process itself, and do things like move from thinking about consent as something that is a one-off deal, but rather something that has to be reestablished and regained continuously as these experiments, which is what all the forest carbon projects are, as conditions change. So it's not a one-off deal, but it's an ongoing process. Maybe we need to move from thinking about rural stakeholders as consenters to thinking about them as planners, designers, evaluators, and managers. Maybe we need to move from thinking about social safeguards to thinking about social contracts, an idea that Michael Brown in one of our chapters in particular advances, where all of these relationships and roles and rights and responsibilities are quite explicitly negotiated and worked out and agreed to. And that includes things like opt-out procedures and procedures for grievances when things don't work. Next slide, please. Maybe we need to move from the concept of safeguards, which to me implies that that the kinds of risks that can pose themselves and the kinds of remedies that are available for them are relatively known or predictable when in fact we're engaged in this very unusual, amazing experiment, and move from that kind of idea to internalizing and operationalizing sort of ongoing processes of risk, benefit, and response assessment in which the rural stakeholders themselves are key actors. Finally, the last thing I want to mention is maybe we need to move from thinking about REDD and payment for environmental services projects as ends in themselves, i.e. if we provide income, then we will get forest preservation, or the reverse, if we preserve our forests, we will get income, to presenting and operationalizing REDD more as one tool that can be used by rural stakeholders and their partners within a larger process of doing development and environmental planning for themselves. So that may sound very lofty and idealistic, but in fact, some of the very strongest cases that are described in the book and in research outside the book really do exactly that. They're cases where communities or associations of communities are in a process of assessing what they want to have happen in relation to their livelihoods and in relation to their ecological settings, in relation to their futures. And they decide that REDD is one instrument that they can bring in that will help them move towards that by providing, an income stream to help support things, but also, helping with the forests. So there really are various ways, I think, various openings to look at how to strengthen the outcomes of REDD Plus projects. And I'll stop there and turn this over to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you all. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we have some further reading for all of you if you're wanting to dive more into any of these topics. And those are our lovely presenters. And you will see in the PDF that we send out or we include in the video description, we always make sure that we include the presentation. So you've got more resources there that you'll be able to access after. So this is now time for your questions. Please feel free to send them in now, and I have a few that I'm going to get us started with. Before I do, I just wanted to really appreciate your point on one of your final slides about REDD Plus being a tool to reach, additional ends as opposed to an end in and of itself. That's something that we kind of circle back to pretty frequently in our work, that, we want REDD to be used as a tool to achieve larger aims, not simply as an end in and of itself. So I know that we've talked about this a little bit in our discussions in preparation for this webinar. But just to be really clear, because there is a lot of confusion in the REDD space and the policy space about what constitutes REDD as defined by the UNFCCC, and why there are these there's confusion about whether project level REDD is part of REDD, which the UNFCCC doesn't necessarily consider anything below the subnational level to be part of their mechanism. So I just wanted to clarify, is it very clear in the book when you're referring to, these national or subnational level processes that are part of those UNFCCC mechanisms, and when it's those other kinds of carbon projects that you talked about that are kind of off doing their own thing, even though they're often kind of lumped in with REDD?
I can jump in if that's okay. This is Stephanie Palladino. I think that overall the different chapters do a good job of making those distinctions, and they don't necessarily frame it those ways, but I think for the most part that can be untangled from the way that people talk about it. I don't know if other folks have another opinion on that.
Well, this is Pam. I mean, one of the things that we've been looking at in Vietnam, particularly when we're looking at safeguards, is this real challenge that you've outlined, Emmeline, which is we've got essentially different things calling themselves REDD, and they often use totally different safeguards mechanisms. So, for example, in Vietnam, we have the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. They have their own set of social and environmental safeguards. UN REDD has their own set of safeguards. We looked at a couple of project level voluntary carbon projects funded by Flora and Fauna International, they have their own set of safeguards. So if you're the national policymaker who is trying to design a nested system, it's really complicated to try to have something that meets your obligations to the UNFCCC, but also allows a space for these projects, the subnational projects, which may not, as you say, meet UNFCCC requirements, but maybe allow space for them to operate as well. And for Vietnam, that's been one of the biggest challenges that they've tried to tackle at the national level, is designing a nested system that works for everyone. And unfortunately, so far, it seems to be a system that no one is happy with.
If this is Stephanie, if I can add one more point to that, I mean, what you're talking about, Ellen, is precisely one of the sources among many of huge confusion at the local level. So, you know, I can personally attest to being in settings where I have local rural stakeholders talking to me about REDD and about either issues they have in pro or in contra, and they're not, they may be talking about just a project that has nothing to do, you know, even in a policy sense with the UN framework, but it all gets rolled into one. And so it has been a very difficult issue, intractable issue on the ground in many cases to deal with those kinds of distinctions.
Thank you. So we'll have to continue to underline the distinction, it seems, as we engage with communities on the ground. You mentioned safeguards, you know, regularly, frequently. It's one of the main focuses of your presentation. So obviously we have a good number of questions about that. So we have one question asking, what role do you see social safeguards and FPIC, the free, prior, and informed consent, playing as we move forward in improving the design of these projects or programs? Do you see this as more of a role of the state or of donors, you know, even despite some of the inconsistencies that you mentioned?
Well, I'll answer for the context of Vietnam because I think it's a very tangible response I can give, and that is the national system of safeguards. They're calling it a safeguards roadmap. I'm not sure what the final name will be. It's going to be fairly minimal. And so it's going to be up to donors if they want to sort of go beyond the standards that were laid out in the Cancun COP meeting. So some donors are doing that. They're saying, you know, we need to have stricter standards. We're going to ask our projects to follow those so they meet both the national standards, which are minimal, plus our higher standards. But the problem then comes at the local level because local, particularly local officials at the subnational level don't understand why they have to meet higher goals for Project A, but in their same district, they might have Project B that has different goals. So it's a real quandary for people at the local level trying to juggle these various approaches and projects. And I don't see a clear way forward unless the UNFCCC wants to revisit this problem and suggest higher standards that sort of match what some of the donors are doing. I think it's going to remain a really intractable problem for a lot of countries.
Thanks. I'm not sure, Stephanie or Shirley, if you want to chime in.
Briefly, Stephanie, jumping in. I mean, I would echo, I think there are echoes of what Pam talks about throughout so many different country contexts. And I think that's part of also, this doesn't necessarily answer the question posed, but it does point to that other component that I was trying to draw out in the presentation, which is just the importance of, I don't know how to say this, social safeguards or social indicators or social guidelines for social practice that are not just brought down from above, but are brought up from below from the folks that are involved, that the importance of that being a component of it. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thanks. And we do have one participant who wanted us to clarify that the UN REDD program doesn't have its own set of safeguards, but that they help countries understand the UNFCCC requirements as well as those of the FCPF and others. So positioning themselves as, you know, trying to gather all of these diverse requirements together and help people kind of wend their way through the process. Another question is that given the several recommendations you have suggested in the presentation from the book, what do you see the next steps being in addressing these issues at the global level to make sure that policymakers, realize and identify or realize these gaps that you have identified and start moving towards addressing them, making sure that the social processes are really part of the larger picture?
Well, I don't want to, go ahead, Shirley.
This is Shirley. I think that is a long road, but a very important road to bring greater understanding of the social processes and safeguards as social processes, as Stephanie brought out. And it may have to take place at multiple levels. The COP meetings do have events, side events, but also events that are part of the diplomatic corps pavilions. And as anthropologists, there are sessions on REDD Plus, and where are we with it? And anthropologists and social scientists, I think, need to get more closely involved in talking at that level with people, get to know the paragraphs and the staff. I think that it's going to be at the global level. It's tough. You have to associate yourself with constituencies to have influence and input into some of these things, but especially since the US is trying to withdraw from the Paris agreements, the only nation in the world. So, I think it's a long haul, but Stephanie, I'd be appreciative of your insight too.
Oh, I wouldn't necessarily call what I have to offer insight. And then I realized that I couldn't actually do what I was about to do, which was I would like to hear from the person who asked the question what they think would be next steps. But I don't know that we have a way for them to quickly enough to do that.
No, unfortunately not. But I can ask. We do have another question that we can move on to if you're ready.
Well, let me just add one thing, which is I think the question of the global level is essential, but we know that the global is going to be made up of all of these countries working together. And so at country level, what we've tried to do with the findings from our research project is influence those national level processes in Vietnam. So several of my research partners are NGOs that sit on advisory panels as REDD plays out at the national level in Vietnam, and they've been very aggressive about saying, let's try to get livelihood monitoring into a safeguards information system, and let's do it in a way that's appropriate for Vietnam. And luckily, we have really good data because we've done a panel survey of 500 households since 2011, following them over time and seeing what these potentially negative or potentially positive livelihood changes might be. And so we have the evidence to argue that livelihood monitoring can be a really not quick or easy, but an effective way to know what the effective REDD is going to be on the ground. And so I think advocacy at the national level is going to influence that global level as well.
Thank you. Are you comfortable sharing any of those, perhaps livelihood indicators that you are using in that survey? Because that is one question one participant is wondering is what kind of indicators would someone use, and is it possible that there are some that could be applicable, outside of the Vietnamese context?
I'm sure there are. I'm happy to share the Vietnam indicators, which I'm sure could be adapted for different country contexts. We have, and I'll share this with you afterwards, Emmeline, several of our NGO partners have websites where they've posted the livelihood surveys and indicators so that other people can use. They've also, one of our partners has posted a REDD social and environmental readiness index, looking at governance issues, looking at some social issues, some livelihood issues. Again, it's very specific to Vietnam, but there's no reason why somebody someplace else couldn't look at it and adapt it for their context. So I'll send those web links for sharing with the webinar participants.
Thanks, and I can make sure that they end up in the YouTube video description so that everyone can access them, because I think that would be a very interesting, especially for people who are looking into adapting these guidelines, or being able to preserve their forests with the support of some of these international processes in context. So we are actually at the end of our time today, so I might follow up with you presenters to see if we can if we want to circle back to any of these questions. So next slide, please, Jenny. And I do want to thank you again for sharing your expertise with our community. It's important for us to get a wide variety of information about REDD+. And I want to thank the participants for coming today and sending in your thoughtful, engaging questions. You'll all receive a follow-up email in a few hours with some additional resources that are specific to this webinar. And there will be some as well in the video description on YouTube, as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. So if you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues, I'm hopefully going to be able to post this by the end of the day. And you can also find previous recordings there of sessions for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Pam, Shirley, and Stephanie, for sharing your expertise with us. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and a happy new year, and hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar in January. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emily.